Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that every story needs,
Yeah.
but we don't always think about it very deeply, and that is how time shapes a story setting. We have a really great article to unpack today. It's called "How Does Time Affect the Setting?" by Artado. I love this. Artado calls himself a curious writer.
Yeah.
And, Carolee, I think you're going to find some of these points really thought-provoking, especially when we start talking about how time impacts mood. Some examples Artado uses like a park and a farm, and we'll even touch on some advice for all the storytellers out there. I'm excited to get into this. What are your initial thoughts?
You know, it's interesting. When we think about setting, we often overlook the role of time. We tend to focus so much on the physical location. Where does the story take place? But time is just as important. It's not just a backdrop. It's a force that shapes the atmosphere, influences character development, and even opens or closes possibilities within the plot.
Yeah, and Artado starts off the article with a very simple definition of setting. They point out that it's not just where the story happens, but when. And I like how they point out that time isn't just about, like, the year the story takes place. It's so much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. Think about a story and the location it's set in. Now, how different would that story feel if it were set in that same location but during a different time period? Like, think about a bustling city during a festival. It's going to have a completely different energy and feel than that same city during a power outage.
That's a really great point, and that actually reminds me of one of the examples that Artado uses in the article. They talk about a park and how a park can feel so cheerful and safe during the day, filled with people enjoying the sunshine. But that same park at night might feel completely different, even a bit eerie and unsettling.
Yeah, it really is amazing how just the time of day can transform a setting. Even the colors that we perceive are affected by the light. Think about a park or public space that you enjoy visiting. Does it feel different at noon than it does at dusk? What about the kinds of activities you see happening there? Does your own personal sense of safety change as the hours pass?
That's so true. I mean, time of day can really impact the whole vibe of a place. But Artado doesn't stop there. They also talk about how seasons can really carry a lot of weight in a story.
Absolutely. We often associate seasons with very specific moods. Spring is a time of new beginnings. Summer is full of energy and warmth. Autumn brings a sense of cozy reflection. And winter often represents a period of stillness and solitude.
Yeah, it's like the setting has its own mood ring or something. But I think what's even more interesting is how those seasonal moods can actually impact a character's journey.
Absolutely. Imagine a passionate romance that blossoms in the summer. What happens to that relationship when the cold winds of winter arrive? Will their connection deepen? Or will the isolation of winter create cracks in their bond? Or think about a character who's struggling with depression. Might the rebirth of spring offer them a glimmer of hope and renewal? Seasons aren't just about pretty scenery. They can be forces that shape our characters' emotional arcs.
That's such a good point. And it makes me think about how time impacts world building, especially when we start considering the past, present, and future.
Okay.
Ardo uses the example of a school to illustrate this. I thought it was really clever.
Yeah.
The past, students were using chalkboards and textbooks. Today, it's all laptops and smartboards. And who knows what classrooms will look like 100 years from now.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating about this concept. It challenges us to think about how time shapes societies and beliefs. The technology available, the social norms, the very possibilities for our characters change so drastically as we move through different time periods. This is where it gets really interesting for anyone who loves to get lost in a good story. Think about the world of your favorite story. Now imagine stepping back 100 years into the past. What does that world look like? How does it function? What limitations might the characters face? Now do the same thing, but fast forward 100 years into the future. It's almost like time travel, right? And it's not just about gadgets and fashion. It's about how the passage of time influences every aspect of the world and the characters who live in it.
It's like time isn't just linear. It's also this force that's shaping societies and beliefs in all these different directions. Okay, before we get too lost in the space-time continuum, I want to bring up another aspect of time that Artado touches on, and that is weather and how the natural world transforms over time. They talk about how a sunny day feels completely different from a rainy day, for instance, and how a forest that was with a field of saplings might become this dense, old-growth forest decades later.
And this is where it gets really interesting when we start to consider real-world events. Think about areas that have been hit by natural disasters or impacted by climate change. The setting is fundamentally altered, and that has a really profound impact on the stories that can be told there.
Yeah, it's like the setting itself becomes a character, reflecting all of the challenges and changes that a community has faced.
Exactly. We can see how a once thriving town might become a ghost town after a devastating flood, or how a community might have to completely adapt their way of life to cope with rising sea levels. The passage of time really leaves its mark on the setting in these powerful ways, and it's definitely something that storytellers can use to create these incredibly impactful narratives.
I'm starting to realize just how much thought goes into crafting a setting, and how time really is such an essential element in that process. Speaking of which, towards the end of the article, Artado starts to share some really fantastic tips for writers, especially about using time to create mood and show change in a story.
What I love about these tips is that they're not just for writers. As readers, being aware of these techniques can actually help us appreciate the craft of storytelling even more. When you notice how an author uses time to build suspense or evoke a specific emotion, it adds this whole other layer of depth to the reading experience.
It's like you're suddenly in on the secret.
Exactly. It transforms you from a passive observer to an active participant in the unfolding of the story.
So let's pause here for a moment and reflect on what we've covered so far. We've seen how time of day, seasons, even the vast stretches of past, present, and future all contribute to the richness of a story's setting. It's definitely more than just picking a location and dropping your characters in, right?
Absolutely. And what's key to remember is that time is an active ingredient in setting. It's not just a passive background element. It's a force that shapes the atmosphere, influences character development, and even dictates what's possible within the plot.
So think about those books and movies you love. I bet you're already seeing them in a new light. Can you spot how the author or director is using time to shape your experience, even in subtle ways?
I'm sure there are tons of examples that are already coming to mind. What's standing out so far?
I'm really fascinated by the idea of time as this force shaping societies and beliefs. And it makes me want to revisit some of my favorite stories and see how the authors use time to build their worlds.
I love that. Keep that in mind as we start diving into Artado's writing tips. Even seemingly small details, like the time of day or the season, can have a significant impact on the story. It's all about those subtle layers that add depth and richness to the reader's experience.
Yeah. Let's unpack those tips. I'm always looking for ways to level up my storytelling.
All right, let's get into it. Okay, so Artado's first tip really focuses on mood. As a storyteller, you need to think about how you want the reader to feel when they enter a scene. Do you want them to feel anxious, hopeful, peaceful? Think about the emotional temperature that you want to set.
It's not just about, describing the physical space, but it's also about creating an emotional atmosphere.
Right. And Artado points out that elements like time of day, weather, even the season can be really powerful tools for establishing that mood. Like imagine a tense conversation between two characters. Now, if it's taking place under a stormy sky with thunder rumbling in the background, that's going to create a very different feeling than if it's a bright, sunny morning.
Yeah, it's like time is working behind the scenes to influence our emotional response to the story.
Exactly. Now, the next tip Artado offers is all about using details to bring the setting to life. Don't just tell us that it's nighttime. Describe the way the moonlight filters through the trees, or how the streetlights cast these long, eerie shadows.
I love that. The idea of really painting a picture with words, it's those sensory details that really make the setting come alive for the reader. It's the difference between saying it was a hot day and describing the beads of sweat trickling down a character's back, or the shimmering heat waves rising from the pavement.
Exactly. Engage the reader's senses. Sight, sound, smell, touch, even taste. And suddenly they're not just reading about the setting, they're experiencing it.
That's what makes you feel truly immersed in the story. What else does Artado suggest?
Well, the next tip focuses on change. As time passes in a story, the setting should also evolve too. Think about that farm that Artado mentioned. After a storm, the fields might be muddy, trees are damaged. But years later, that farm might be thriving. Or it could be abandoned and decaying. Time leaves its mark.
So we can really use the setting to reflect the changes that are happening within the story itself.
Exactly. And on a larger scale, you can use the passage of time to show societal shifts, technological advancements, or even the impact of environmental changes on a community.
That makes me think about all those post-apocalyptic stories, where the setting has been so dramatically altered by some kind of catastrophic event, the crumbling buildings, the overgrown vegetation. It all tells a story about what happened before and how the world has changed.
Exactly. The setting becomes a character in itself, reflecting the hopes, fears, and struggles of the people who inhabit it.
This is making me think about how we can use time to create this sense of history and depth in a story.
Speaking of history, Artado's last tip is one of my favorites. Play with different time periods. Imagine showing the world as it was in the past, present, and future. It's like having a time machine for storytelling.
Oh, I love that. It's like layering these different settings on top of each other,
Yeah.
which could lead to some really fascinating plot twists. Imagine a character from the past suddenly finding themselves in the present day. Talk about a culture shock.
That's a fantastic example. And think about the potential for conflict and misunderstanding when characters from different time periods collide. Their values, beliefs, even their language might be completely at odds with each other. It's like a recipe for dramatic tension.
I'm starting to see how mastering this element of time could be a real game changer for my writing. It's not just about describing where a story takes place. It's about using time to create mood, to show change, to build suspense, even transport the reader to these different worlds.
Exactly. And as we've talked about, these techniques aren't just for writers. As readers, being aware of how authors manipulate time can really deepen our understanding and appreciation of a story.
It's like we're being let in on the secret code of storytelling.
I love that analogy.
So to recap, we've covered Artado's insightful tips for writers, and we've explored how understanding the power of time can really enrich the experience for readers as well.
We've looked at how time can influence mood, reflect change, and even allow us to travel through different eras.
But there's one more important question I think we should address. Why does all of this matter? What's the big takeaway for our listeners today?
That's a great question. I think it really gets to the heart of why we are drawn to stories in the first place. Stories are about change. They're about characters who are transformed by their experiences, by the challenges they face, and by the passage of time itself.
And I think what we're seeing here is that the setting isn't just this passive backdrop for those transformations. It's an active force shaping the characters' journeys.
Precisely. Time is the element that allows for growth, decay, conflict, and resolution. It's really the catalyst for everything that makes a story compelling.
So whether you're a writer crafting a world or a reader getting lost in a story, remember this. Time isn't just a ticking clock. It's the heartbeat of your narrative.
Beautifully said. Now, before we wrap up, Artado ends the article with some really interesting final thoughts on time and setting, and I think they're going to really resonate with their listeners.
I'm all ears. What does Artado have to say?
So Artado says that in their conclusion, that it's time that really brings a story to life. It's not just about stating facts like the year or the season. It's about weaving time into the narrative itself to create this really immersive experience for the reader.
I love that. And, I think as a reader, I'm going to be paying a lot more attention to how authors use those elements of time.
To build suspense.
Or evoke those specific emotions in me as I'm reading. It really does help us to understand the characters and the world that they live in on a much deeper level.
You're right. That is one of the most valuable takeaways from our deep dive today. Time isn't just this background detail, it's this really powerful tool that shapes our entire experience as a reader. Think about it. Time can make us feel joy, fear, nostalgia, this whole range of emotions.
It's like time is this invisible hand.
Yeah.
Guiding us along on our emotional journey through the story.
Oh, I love that. And it makes me wonder how our experience of a story might change if we were to read it at different points in our own lives. A book that deeply resonated with us in our youth might hold completely different meanings when we revisit it years later. Our own experiences with time shape our understanding of the world. And that, in turn, influences how we interpret the stories that we encounter.
It's like, the story might stay the same, but we as readers are constantly changing, and that inevitably changes how we connect with that story.
You got it. Time is this constant force, but our relationship to it is dynamic. And that's what makes this exploration of time and storytelling so endlessly fascinating. It's this constant interplay between the story itself, the author's craft, and the reader's own personal journey through time.
I'm so glad we took the time to really unpack this today. What a fantastic deep dive.
Me too. It's amazing how much depth and richness we can uncover when we start to pay attention to these seemingly subtle elements of storytelling.
I think we should leave our listeners with a challenge. What do you think?
Oh, I love that idea. What do you have in mind?
The next time you pick up a book or watch a movie, or even just listen to a friend tell a story, I want you to really pay close attention to how time is being used. Notice the time of day, the season, the historical context, any details that give you that sense of time unfolding, and then ask yourself, how is time shaping my experience of this story?
I love that challenge. I bet you'll start to see the world of storytelling in a whole new light.
Until next time, Keep exploring. And remember, time is on your side.